Hey there. Say hey to the Eurobears. Say hi, Eurobears. He's not saying hi to you that clearly. Hey, I thought I would make a really short video lecture for you guys to help you out with some of the additional sources that might be helpful on DBQs and any other essays you may write on the Inner Warriors period. So here's a few additional sources that you may find helpful. Hey, there you go. You're saying hi. Say hi. Say hi. Yay, there's all right, guys. Here you go.
Hey there, Eurobears. Hey, thanks for taking the time to watch another video for this particular unit. I'll try my best to make this as quick as possible, and I hope you find this information very beneficial. First of all, I want to talk about this. This isn't necessarily an outside document, although I guess you could sort of consider it an outside document. But this is very important. The College Board has asked questions about the Bauhaus architecture movement in the past, and it could pop up in the future. So make sure that you know this. So Bauhaus was an architectural movement that began in Munich, Germany in 1919, really out of the ashes of Germany. Not that Germany was attacked in the First World War like they will be in the Second World War, but certainly culturally they were emerging out of one era and into another. And the Bauhaus Architecture School reflects this. So you take a look at this particular building here, it's very, very different. It's very modern. It's very 20th century. The goal of the Bauhaus Architecture School, as developed by Walter Gropius, whose name you see here, and the Bauhaus, those aren't the years of his life, obviously. Those are the years that he built this building. There's nothing ornate about it. So the purpose of Bauhaus is to be chic and functional. Chic and functional. That's it. Nothing ornate about it. And it reflects a break from the past. There's nothing very traditional about this at all. Whenever I personally look at Bauhaus stuff, I think of IKEA. There's something very IKEA-like about Bauhaus. All right, so when you think about the additional documents in the 1920s, or 1920s, 1930s, it might be important to think about the rise of dictatorships out of democracies. So when we think about the three big dictators of the interwar year periods, you might want to think about how these particular outside sources relate to these three guys. And I don't have any additional sources from Italy. I'll be providing most of the additional sources from Germany and one from the Soviet Union. Okay, so after World War One, there were a couple of big World War One books that came out, which were highly influential in how people thought about the First World War. And the first is probably the most famous, All Quiet on the Western Front, by the German Erich Maria Remarque, who was a veteran of the First World War and wrote about the terribleness of life in the trenches. And there's a real sense of futility in All Quiet on the Western Front. There's the sense that your humanity wasn't worth much if you were a soldier in the trench. And then also that the war was being dictated by people who really didn't care about your individual life. All Quiet on the Western Front was made into a movie pretty quickly after it was published in the 1920s, and this is during the silent era. And they actually had veterans reenact battles using trenches on the Western Front. So it was a pretty incredible movie for its time. But this is also a very important book that came out of the First World War. And this was the best-selling World War II book in Germany, which makes it interesting. This is Storm of Steel by Ernst Uner. And Storm of Steel is a very harsh, realistic portrayal of what life was like during the First World War. But the feel of it was different from All Quiet on the Western Front. It was very tough, it was very masculine, even though it also did not kind of glorify war. I mean, there's a harshness and brutality of Storm of Steel. This is a current American edition that you're looking at, the front cover of. This is just completely off topic, but if you look closely, it says there's a foreword by Karl Melantis, the author of Matterhorn, on there. Karl Melantis was a United States Marine during the Vietnam War, and Matterhorn is one of his great books on the Vietnam War. So he obviously drew a lot from Storm of Steel. Okay, let's go to the Soviet Union. So for an additional document for the Soviet Union, how about the composer Dmitri Shostakovich? This is not the last time we'll talk about Shostakovich. He is one of the great musicians that come out of the Soviet Union. And so Stalin and the Soviet Union wanted music to be all propaganda. So very, very upbeat, very martial, very tough, kind of, makes you want to get up and, hit the factories and produce steel for, another 5-year plan or something like that. Dmitri Shostakovich is a little bit of a rebel, which was a very dangerous, dangerous thing to do in Stalin's Russia. He wrote music that had sort of a dark, depressing undertone to it because I don't know, Shostakovich, like a lot of musicians, felt that there was beauty in sadness. And the Fifth Symphony, he relied a lot upon traditional Russian folk music, which was infused into the symphony. And so, how did he get away with this? Well, it's very peasant oriented, so it's very proletariat. So Dmitri Shostakovich, you should also know from what we're learning about Stalin that he attacked the Jews in the 1950s. And Shostakovich, a bit of a rebel, he drew a lot upon Jewish music as well, and he incorporated that into his symphony. So here's a little quote for you from Shostakovich. The Fifth Symphony, which I just referenced, was a symphony from the interwar era. The next symphony we'll talk about, his Seventh Symphony, was very important during World War II. Okay, so let's go back to Weimar era Germany. Weimar era Germany was a period of incredible freedoms. We don't think about this a lot, or at least I don't think most people think about this a lot today in the United States, because Germany goes from being, the Second Reich, the Second Empire that Bismarck had created, all the way up through World War One, and they were this tough martial country. And then, we have the rise of Hitler in World War II. But never forget that in the 1920s, Weimar Germany was a very wild place. There was a sense of a complete rejection of tradition. Remember, there were a lot of socialist and communist movements that had built up in the early 20th century, even before World War One. And so there was a sense that they should do new things. So you're looking at a picture here of Marlene Dietrich in a film called Cabaret, about cabaret, the musical theater that developed in the 1920s in Germany. I don't have a slide for it, but it's also worth knowing that the Germans did incredible things in the silent film era. Especially there was a filmmaker named Fritz Lang who made a film called Metropolis, which was a dystopian view of the future. But here, let me give you this. This is something a little bit different that I bet not a lot of AP Euro teachers around the country talk about. This individual's name is Magnus Hirschfeld, who founded the very first scientific institute to explore and to study and do research on human sexuality. And so this was developed in Berlin. It lasted from 1919 until the Nazis shut it down, go figure, in 1933, in which he did scientific research on heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality, the whole diversity of human sexuality, and he wrote books about it. But in 1930, well, in the end of the 1920s, the beginning of the 1930s, let me clarify that, the beginning of the 1930s, the Nazis wanted to shut this guy down, and really they wanted to capture all of Berlin. Berlin became one of the most diverse, accepting cities in the world in the 1920s. So if you had an alternative sexual lifestyle, Berlin was the place to go. Berlin was the place where you would be accepted. So think about that. That's happening in Berlin. In the north part of Germany, or in the south, in Munich, Hitler's taking over with the Nazis. So Hitler, in wanting to take over Berlin, the capital city, he wants to change the culture of Berlin and kind of get rid of all these homosexuals and other people who he considered to be deviants. And so he sends up north there his Minister of Enlightenment. This is Joseph Gurbles. And Gurbles' job was to go to Berlin first to sort of encourage young boys to become Nazis. We're talking about boys in their late teens, early 20s, and got them involved in the Nazi parties. And then they would go and beat up gays and go into the cabaret and just start turning over tables and wrecking things up. As a movement to get to scare out people who the Nazis considered to be deviant. So let's learn some additional documents from this era. So this is Christopher Isherwood, and you can see his name down there on the bottom right. Christopher Isherwood. He was a gay man from Britain who went to Berlin so that he could, be free and be who he is. And he experienced this kind of incredibly free lifestyle in Berlin. He experienced cabaret culture. He was able to be who he wanted to be out and open in public, and he felt free. And then here come the Nazis, and the Nazis chased him back to Britain. And he wrote a book about it called Goodbye to Berlin. And not a lot of people have heard of this book, Goodbye to Berlin by Christopher Isherwood, but many, many people, at least of an older generation, remember this. Goodbye to Berlin by Christopher Isherwood was turned into a play and a musical called Cabaret, and that was made into a film in the late 1970s, starring Liza Minnelli, who you see sort of dancing on the T of the cabaret there. So Cabaret came from the book Goodbye to Berlin by Christopher Isherwood, which was a testimony to what Berlin was like in the 1920s. So Hitler used a lot of propaganda to encourage people to support Nazism and his vision of Germany. And you had Joseph Goebbels, who was his Minister of Enlightenment. And Goebbels and Hitler picked this woman, Leni Riefenstahl, to be their chief propagandist. And Leni Riefenstahl was an actress and a dancer who became a filmmaker. And she has been known as the most powerful woman in Nazi Germany because Hitler said, make films to celebrate the Nazi Party. And she said, okay, I'll do it. And she pretty much started making demands on Goebbels and Hitler, who ended up bowing to her will. So Leni Riefenstahl got exactly what she wanted. Hey, before I go on with Leni Riefenstahl, she didn't die until the early 21st century. I think it was like 2002, maybe, she passed away. She lived a very long time. She spent some time in jail after the war, but she was found, well, I guess not. She wasn't in prison for the rest of her life or sentenced to death. She wasn't considered to be that high-ranking of a Nazi. But she sure did convince a lot of Germans that Nazism was great. These are the two big films of Leni Riefenstahl. The one on the left, Olympia, is the film of the 1936 Olympics. Hitler had uh, Hitler had gotten the 1936 Olympics to be in Berlin, and he wanted to use the 36 Olympics as a platform to demonstrate the superiority of the German Aryan people, how they were physically and mentally superior to everybody else. And certainly the Germans did get most of the gold medals that year. Olympia is actually a quite incredible film in terms of how she filmed the athletes. Cameras that would spin around the track and follow the athletes. She would bury, or she would dig out these little trenches so that she could get film footage of the camera looking up at people doing a long jump, for example. So the cinematography is really quite incredible from Olympia. And for what it's worth, Olympia, that film is where we get some of our best film footage from the Ohio State runner Jesse Owens, the Buckeye Bullet. You got to love Jesse Owens because he defied Hitler's theories of superiority. He won 4 gold medals, and he was an African American, and Hitler did not like that very much. So, but that's Olympia by Leni Riefenstahl. And then the film on the right is Triumph of the Will. Triumph of the Will, or Triumph des Willens, as you see there in German. And this was the big propaganda film that really just featured several Nazi rallies. But the cinematography in that was made to fashion Hitler to looking like a god. So Leni Riefenstahl used a bunch of different camera angles to film Hitler, to make him look just wonderful in all of his grandeur or something like this. So if we get a chance in class, I'll show you some film footage from both of these films. All right, and then this is the last additional document that I would like to talk about, and I saved my favorite for last. And again, this isn't one that's really all that popular, but I find this particular book fascinating. So this is Erich Fromm. Erich Fromm was a German psychoanalyst and philosopher, and he got out of Nazi Germany and he ended up living in the United States of America. And he's one of several thinkers, especially psychologists, who really wondered, how could this happen? Germany was a civilized country. Germany was a technologically advanced country. Germany was really a multicultural country. They had a rich heritage, and their people were very, very intelligent. I mean, this is the country that produced Goethe and Beethoven. What happened? How could a people that were so smart and so arguably humane, you know, reach for Hitler to be their leader? So he explores this in this book called Escape from Freedom. And this book is a great book because it is in part a philosophy book, and it's part a psychology book, and it's part a history book. Eric Fromm goes back to the Reformation. This book starts with the Reformation. So, sort of like this class, it goes from the Reformation to the 20th century. And it talks about how human beings deal with freedom. So, you think about the Reformation with Martin Luther in Germany. He says, you don't just be obedient to authority. You're free to read the Bible on your own. You must educate yourself. You must read the Bible, and you must have a personal relationship with God. Now, that sounds wonderful because, you're free to have this individual relationship with God. You don't need any intermediaries like the Pope or a priest or something. But it also places a great deal of responsibility on you. And with freedom and responsibility comes anxiety. And you feel this kind of tenseness like, oh, I'm free, but being free is scary. And so sometimes freedom actually leads people to embrace a dictatorship because it's easy. You just kind of fall in line. And with this dictatorship, you feel like you're part of a group. And of course, this is the heart of fascism. You feel like you're part of the group, and your group is great. It's powerful. It can conquer the world. And even though your individual life isn't worth anything, the fact that you're contributing to the greatness of your civilization as a whole means a lot to you. So this is Escape from Freedom. It's a fantastic book. Again, it's part psychology. It gets into like the way we think and the way we feel. It's part history because it goes from Reformation to 20th century. And it's philosophy. It deals with the concept of freedom. And hey, as I'm thinking about you guys, Eurobears, you're all at the, or most of you are at the end of your high school career. You're mostly juniors and seniors. And maybe some of you are feeling this too. You're finally gonna leave home. You're gonna go out and be on your own. And that's an exciting thing. It's a wonderful thing. But maybe you're like, oh, this is scary. Would you feel some sense of comfort if somebody just said, "Hey, here's what you're going to do. Here's where you're going to go. Here's where you're going to live. Here's everything. Your path is going to be laid out for you. You're not going to have to make any decisions on your own, and you're going to be part of this super huge corporation that's going to make a lot of money and it's going to offer you security for the rest of your life." You might be tempted. It's like, oh, well, I don't have to struggle with going to college and choosing my own major and trying to make it on my own in the world. Like, I just join this massive organization. That's essentially kind of the idea of Escape from Freedom. So, okay, I guess I'm going to mention these guys real quick here. These would not be good things for you guys to write about as an additional document. This is just for you. But in the United States of America, following World War II, we too were very interested in how could people do this, and we Americans, you know, looked at the Germans and the Japanese as well, and we're like, well, a lot of Americans felt that there's something different about their cultures. The Germans come from this, Prussian militaristic culture. The Japanese come from their own sort of feudal heritage. These are not freedom-loving people. We are freedom-loving people. And most Americans truly believe that Americans could never openly embrace a fascist dictatorship. What you're looking at here are three psychologists that questioned that. Could Americans become fascist? And what we find is quite easily, Americans can become fascist. And so you're looking at three psychologists there that, in various ways, replicated the environment of fascism and watched Americans who they experimented on, I mean, from all classes, male and female, essentially start adapting a fascist mindset. So if you're interested, if you've studied any psychology, or you've probably come across these men. Solomon Asch did experiments on conformity in the 1950s. Stanley Milgram did a very controversial experiment in which he asked people to seemingly, although they weren't really doing it, but they thought they were, kill another person with electric shocks. And what he found is that he could get 60% of Americans to kill another American within 45 minutes, a complete stranger, if they simply knew that they weren't going to didn't have to take responsibility for hurting another person. So it's a very controversial experiment. You can't replicate it today, at least not in the United States of America. But there's Stanley Milgram. If you look up his experiment, Obedience to Authority, you can find a lot of it online. You could probably watch the whole experiment on YouTube. And then in the early 1970s, 1972, there's the famous Stanford University prison experiment conducted by Philip Zimbardo. Philip Zimbardo is still around today and still writes. And in that, he simply divided students up into guard and prisoner and locked them in a basement for what he planned to be 2 weeks. But he called the experiment off after 6 days because the guards were being so abusive to the prisoners. Revealing that, and kind of the conclusion of Zimbardo's experiment is there is evil inside of all of us. There is evil inside of all of us. It just doesn't get a chance to come out in our everyday culture. But when given the opportunity, there is something bad. You could really hurt other people. And that's what all three of these guys found out. So even we Americans have the germ of Nazism within us. And that's it, guys. That's all I have for you. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this and hopefully take some notes and profit from it. I think you will. All right, guys. Have a great day.